We are live. Welcome back, everybody. I'm here again with Alex Grant, and today we are going to pick up on some of the themes from our last discussion with Chris Catrone. In particular, the working class composition today, how it's different from 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 150 years ago, and what that really means for the perspectives of the working class and socialism. So I think we'll start with talking about how it's the working class is different. So I'll outline a few things right off the hop, and we can go from there and for what that means for socialists today, and whether we have to think about waiting for another 10 or 20 years or not. So I made a lot of notes here, but let's work it down to let's start with gig work. So gig work, for example, is a lot of jobs are now gig work today in this economy, as opposed to 50 years ago, 100 years ago. 39% of the total workforce in the United States does at least some freelance work, and that's up from only 20% in 2014. And 29% of the total workforce in the United States have gig work as their primary jobs. And, for a socialist party, you might think that because they're independent contractors, this is not the same as, being in a factory or being in an organized place with other workers where you can see the boss, you can see the other workers, you see who you experience who's running what and how the system works as a whole. Whereas now it's like you've got an app. You're not even talking to a boss. Your relationship with capital is you and the app, and the app's telling you what to do and when. For some jobs. So that poses a problem for organizing potentially. Then there's the situation with organized labor. Union membership sits in America at 10% today, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, down from a high of 33%. And this is the United States. Canadian union density is falling, but still a lot higher than the States. It's at roughly 30% today. A lot of these unions are public sector work unions. So jobs in federal government, in provincial government, in municipal government. Does that matter one way or the other? Like, are they going to be as useful to a revolutionary moment as, say, industrial workers? That's a question there. The unions are more popular than ever. Not than ever, but since 1965, actually. So that's great. That seems great. It's sitting at 71% now. But yet, at the same time, they're not growing at all in relation to the total population. So we've seen this jump in popularity, but the unions themselves are not actually growing. And there's some interesting reasons for that. I'm going to take some analysis from Derek Varn here and note that they have little incentives today to grow membership anymore due to assets in things like stocks and the growth and value of long-term property holdings, keeping them afloat. So a lot of these unions and these working class organizations actually just own a lot of excellent real estate, the buildings themselves in prime locations, from legacy ownership from a long time ago. The exception is unions that are in dying industries, where they're actively seeking more membership. But the main big organizations don't seem to care. They have money coming in. They're able to keep themselves afloat, and they're not really actively trying to pump numbers up. So that leads to the question of like leadership. Yeah, these are the leadership of all of these unions, and even the unions themselves, really more wholly, are very wedded to the duopoly parties in the States. You could say the same thing for Canada. They're wedded to the Liberals, the NDP in the States, the Democratic Party especially, but also now increasingly the Republican Party here and there, which obviously is a problem for socialists trying to organize class independence. there's the problem of franchises, right? Because now, let's say you're trying to organize McDonald's workers. Well, each contract, each is different for every single McDonald's that has. I mean, one owner might own five McDonald's or whatever it is, but in each state, in each separate McDonald's, they're going to be have separate contracts. A little different for something like a Starbucks, which is actually owned by one big company and it's all one. So it's easier to unionize them. And then there's, of course, the issues with the laws. Union laws are different in each state, and some of them basically actively make the Labor Relations Act null and void in a lot of these states. And so you're having to kind of instead of being able to easily organize across sectors and across the country, you have like 50 different sub categories of unions that are atomized, all bureaucratic, all equally beholden to the ruling class parties in one way or another. I have some more stuff, but why don't we just start there? Oh, also one more thing: the sectoral employment. So the service sector is always kind of led in the United States, but construction and manufacturing were much closer in 1968. I have a graph in front of me, but you guys can't see it. Now in the United States, the service sector is like three times greater in proportion to the total workforce than the industrial and the construction, and then manufacturing and agriculture and all that. So that's what we're looking at today. Seems like a much tougher landscape to organize from than what we had 100 years ago, what we had 50 years ago. It's a different playbook. Are things as good as Marxists say, who argue that the working class is larger than ever before, communism is more popular, yet this is the reality of the composition of the working class?
Cool, that's a lot to bite off. So, hey, great to be back on the show, Eamon. So in terms of the composition of the working class, it's changed. It's totally true. The composition of the working class has changed, and if you don't recognize that, then you're stuck in a fantasy land. So it has changed. But does that mean revolution's off the agenda? So these two things are not the same, right? That, they say, oh, there aren't the industrial workers that there used to be, and therefore revolution is off the agenda. Well, first of all, actually, it's also a parochial view. There are fewer industrial workers in the OECD, in the so-called advanced capitalist countries, that I think, just off the top of my head, manufacturing was about 30 to 40% of the workforce in Canada, the United States, in the sort of 50s and 60s, approximately. Maybe you got different numbers, but I think it's about that. And now it's about 10% in these countries, maybe even less now, right? But okay, does that mean that things aren't being made? No, there's massive manufacturing. It's happening in China. It's happening in Indonesia, happening in Mexico, right? So there's massive manufacturing. The industrial working class has been moved to different parts of the planet, parts that were overwhelmingly agrarian and peasant. So the global ranks of the working class is far larger than it used to be. But okay, let's narrow down and be nationalists, not internationalists, for a minute, and just look at US, Canada, uh, the richest countries on the planet. Yes, the industrial working class is smaller, but does that mean that the rest of the population isn't working class? So we talk about gig work. Are these people not working class? Of course they're working class. In fact, if you want to get your stereotypical industrial worker from the 1960s, an auto worker, for example, that auto worker has got a far better standard of life than today's gig worker, right? So, and you wouldn't say, but to go on the other side of it, you wouldn't say that gig worker is so impoverished that they are declassed, that they're homeless and just fighting for every morsel. No, yeah, uh, lots of friends who are gig worker. I've been a gig worker, so there's still parts. It still have enough stability for political consciousness and political activity. Is it easy to form a union? No, it ain't. No. Although, but has it happened? Yeah, I remember the Foodora workers in Toronto. They formed a union, and promptly the capitalists shut everything down. But they formed a collective consciousness, a collective interest. They organized. They had some very good protests. They uh, developed class consciousness. These things happen. The working class has always changed, and capitalism has always changed. They find new ways to exploit people, and in many ways, actually, what is gig work if not piecework in a
Mm-hmm.
way, which is not new. Marx talked about piecework and analyzed it in detail in Das Kapital. In fact, there's the section on piecework was uh, went into detail in the uh, actually in Capital. There's a whole section of they used to farm out needle trades to small shops. So you'd have a big sort of clothing company, which would then go to a small cottage, what's in Britain was called cottage industry, and say, okay, here's a bunch of cloth and here's the patterns, and they'd get some hyper exploited women who would then sew that into dresses and sell back the finished dresses to the company. What's that? It's exactly the same as gig work. This is from the 19th century. Didn't change. And and actually Marx analyzed that this form of cottage industry lived hand in hand with advanced industry and machinery. So there ends up being this kind of fairy tale, actually romanticization of the past, of the working class, or in its many ranks, marching forward, reading Communist Manifesto, ready for revolution. It was never that easy. It was never that easy. And then that changed. In fact, the during the Paris Commune, which was the first workers' state that Marx and Engels analyzed in detail, I think the average size of a shop in Paris at the time of the Paris Commune was something like 8 workers. Right? So massive industrial armies didn't exist anywhere except Britain, right? And really, the stereotype of the industrial worker didn't come about until the 1930s. Fordism, right? Assembly lines. Assembly lines are a product of the 1920s and 30s. So that's sort of like synonymous with people's mental image of the Marxist revolutionary proletariat. But this all came about 50 years after Marx's death, right? So working class changes. And actually, the first auto plants, they used to put armed guards on the doors of those auto plants in the 1930s. So when the communist CIL organizers went to try and organize those auto plants, they
Mm-hmm.
were lucky if they were only beaten up, right? Many of them were murdered. So that wasn't an easy task to organize the industrial organization. And it was huge battles where people were killed. to develop industrial organization, right? So it was said that this was impossible. And then it became possible, and then it became the norm, and then those industries entered into decline. I think the what was it when it was the United Auto Workers prior to becoming the Canadian Auto Workers in Canada. I think there was something like 300,000 auto workers in Canada, and now it's under 50,000. It might even be 30,000 actual auto workers for GM, Chrysler, or whatever it's called today, Stellantis or whatever it's called. So it's the changing nature of the working class. It brings in challenges, absolutely, but actually more challenges for union organization than revolutionary organization.
Okay, so yeah, let's talk about what's the
Yeah.
difference there.
Well, union organization, well, when you're asking workers to join a union, then you need to convince the majority of them. You're going to convince the majority of workers that a union would help them in their plant and against every opposition of the boss. And size matters. Yes, there is quantity into quality, that the bigger a workplace, the easier it is, and the more obvious it is that a union will be beneficial. That and there's not so much turnover. You get small workplaces, lots of turnover. You get a couple of people of interest in the union, but then after a while, people move on to other jobs, and it gets very difficult, right? So yeah, you make it more difficult to organize unions. Actually, Lenin was said at one point that he never thought more than 20% of the working class would ever be a member of a union. Right. So being a member of a union is important, but it's not everything for revolutionary consciousness. Actually, very often, unions only organize the higher skilled, more privileged sections of the working class, always throughout history. Go back to Marx and Engels, the 19th century. It's overwhelmingly the higher skilled, higher paid, more privileged sections. None of this ever stopped revolutions from happening.
But are those not the highest skilled laborers? Do they not more naturally become the advanced layers that are more conscious?
Yes. Yes. Well, yeah. Well, the thing is, it depends what you mean by advanced layers. This is something uh, that is something that is won through struggle, right? So what's the advanced layer in one period might not be the advanced layer in another. And, I hate to sort of throw out around the word dialectics, but there is a dialectical relationship that's not a linear relationship being between economics and politics and political organizing. So sometimes you can get quite an accidental uh, sector of the working class playing a vanguard role, an advanced role, due to the accident of leadership. And there's an accidental element of where you have good leadership versus where you have bad leadership. That actually, the auto workers, I know the Canadian auto workers very well, who became Unifor, and yeah, they were UAW. They became the Canadian Auto Workers. Then they became Unifor. And Canadian Auto Workers was to the left of the United Auto Workers in the States and split away. And they were right on the left of the Canadian labor movement. And in the 1990s, were criticizing the NDP from the left, were calling for social unionism, were calling for general strikes, organizing on that basis. And then what happened is that come the 2000s, they actually started signing deals with the liberals, and they moved to the right of the movement. And in the last few years, the old leader of the Unifor now was kicked out for corruption. So they were far right, corrupt sector of the movement. So what is an advanced layer can then be pushed into a backward layer. But there's nothing, there's no sort of direct relationship to economics of why this happens. Right? It is the politics of the union, and politics is related to economics, I guess, in the same way as weather is related to climate. But climate is not going to tell you what the weather's going to be tomorrow, right? So there's the role of the individual in history. There's the accident of where people end up organizing, you know. So Chicago teachers are well known for being left-wing and radical, and at least over the last couple of decades. Is anything in the water in Chicago? No, it's accidental. It just happens to be that a collection of socialists got a foundation in the Chicago Teachers Union, started playing a role there.
So speaking
Right.
of
It could have been Seattle, it could have been Detroit, it could have been New York, it could have been anywhere, but it happened to be Chicago.
so speaking of teachers,
Yeah.
um, that's public tends to be public sector, mostly public
Yep.
sector. Does it matter what sector of the working class becomes militant and radical? Right. If we get McDonald's workers and gig workers
Mhm.
organized, is that how meaningful is that for a revolution? If they're not stopping, they don't really have control over transportation, infrastructure, manufacturing, kind of the key pillars of the commanding heights of a capitalist economy.
Well, it depends what question you're asking. Are you asking, are the McDonald's workers going to be the key lever in the insurrection that overthrows American capitalism?
No.
Or, exactly, or are you asking, is the development of class consciousness and organization amongst the McDonald's workers um, furthering the general level of class consciousness and struggle in society that leads us one step forward towards revolution?
Sure.
Exactly. So to have a successful revolution, yes, you need the commanding heights of the working class, right? The advanced, the key sectors. So you need transport, you need communications, you need power, you need all of these things to successfully overthrow capitalism. Those sectors of the working class. Actually, famously in the Russian Revolution, the train engineers were Menshevik. They were more high level of education and more privileged than the mostly unorganized working class uh, in Tsarist Russia. And they were Menshevik, and actually they ended up sabotaging the revolution, the rail workers. That was really important. Didn't stop the revolution, but did make life very, very complicated for the news workers state. Right. And then actually what happened is unorganized workers went to those train drivers and conducted propaganda, agitation amongst them, and convinced them to stop the. But no, that's just a side point. But yes, you do need those strategic sectors to wage a revolution, but that's not what's on the table today. What's on the table today is advancing organization generally, but and consciousness generally. So any sector is a good sector.
Right. So okay. So then that gets us to kind of dovetailing from our last conversation with Chris. How we go about increasing that class consciousness in general? Because Chris's argument from last time wasn't so much that revolution was impossible, but that there was no working class as a class today, in the sense that it's aware of itself as a class, um, that it's organized in any kind of way, that it has even a working class like culture. Um, Everything's atomized. That there's no, like, when people get off work, they're not going to the pub and talking to other workers. They're going on their phones and watching Netflix at home. There's a isolation and atomization now across classes that didn't exist back then, and that what needs to be rebuilt is, um, before politically, he's arguing that socially and culturally, institutions for workers and the working classes in general, um, can be a part of that. A political movement can build out of from there, but that the building the political movement first is premature, according to him.
Right. So I got, some people criticize me for interrupting or putting words in Chris's mouth and stuff like that. But I think his argument is fundamentally dishonest. And I think his argument actually comes down to it's impossible. And it's a dishonest argument. So, oh, no, no, decades, decades, decades. Oh, I'm still a Marxist. But no, not now. Not now actually means never. Not now does mean never, especially when you don't track out, okay, what do you envision happening? What is this perfect working class that you envision that makes revolution possible? Right? Which he doesn't. He just and for every positive thing that someone might, like a Marxist, an orthodox like Marxist like myself would say, then he would come out with a negative, naysaying counterfactual. Right? And of course, we haven't overthrown capitalism, so there is something negative to say about every movement. That's dialectics. It's contradictory. Right? You can say, oh, Black Lives Matter, fantastic, largely spontaneous mass uh, movement with revolutionary implications. And these but it fell into identity politics. Right? You can say any negative counterfactual that you like, and then you never actually have to engage in the positive of a real living movement. There is no such thing as a perfect movement. Again, quote Lenin. These schoolmasters who talk about the perfect movement have never actually seen a real one, right? And it doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a perfect movement. Every single movement is contradictory, and every failed movement, yeah, has a possibility of falling into reaction. That's the whole point of failure. But that doesn't negate the possibility of success. So, yeah, forgive me for calling out Chris for, he says he's still a Marxist, and he says that he thinks that could be a revolution in decades. I call bullshit on that, to be honest. That I don't think it ever leads there.
So
It's not a real, yeah, sorry.
so what do we make of, what do Marxist organizers today, revolutionaries today, make of the problem of this subjective factor of
Yes.
alienation? Well, I mean leadership too, but alienation, of atomization, yeah, it just is a fact that workers, even outside of the factory, outside of the workplace, have less interaction. They're lonelier today than they ever were before. And I think it's not just a problem. It's not just a problem for people's mental health, but I think it's a problem socially. The fabric of society is kind of dispersed and atomized.
Actually, think about it. Does perpetual systemic misery lead to this long-term stability of the society?
I'm
No,
not sure. It can be
no,
certain.
it doesn't.
It can be profited upon though.
Of course, of course. Yeah, yeah, the freaking capitalists will sell you the rope that you hang them with, right? Um, that's a semi-quote as well, right? It's then is that Brecht? I can't remember. Anyway, um, so of course they'll be profiting from it, and but the reality is nobody's happy with modern capitalism. That does not lead to stability of the system. It leads to extreme instability. We're seeing extreme instability, war, environmental crisis, riots, upheavals. Everything you can imagine is leading to massive instability. This is a society that's teetering. I think the real confusion comes is misunderstanding the difference between objective and subjective, right? And this is philosophical. In politics, the subjective factor is revolutionary organizing, and the objective factor is the social weight and consciousness of the working class, right? And the social weight of the working class has never been higher on a global scale.
It's true.
That's yeah, totally indubitable. You know, it's like you look at China, you look at India, you look even in Africa, you got developing working class in many countries that were largely agrarian. So, but there's a multi-billion strong working class, the biggest in human history, and has the levers of power. Yes, you've got gig workers, large part of the working class, who you could say don't have much power in an economic sense. Although, there's the power of there's the economic power of strategic sectors, but there is the raw political power of mass movements and mass demonstrations. So these are still people who can come out on the streets. But then, okay, the strategic sectors are a smaller number of people. Are they less strategic? No, they're more strategic. Just in time production means that a few hundred workers can destroy supply lines for the whole of North America. That a relatively small number of workers, well organized, strategically placed, can totally paralyze capitalist society.
Right. The whole system, to be as profitable it is, has to be as fragile as it is as well, which
Yes,
is what we saw during the pandemic. So
exactly.
given all that, and given the size of the working class, and given the popularity of unions, like what does it say that, given all of that, we still don't see growth in the
Yeah, and that's
unionizations?
political subjective. That's not economic.
Hmm.
That's not the potential.
Right. So the
That's
potential's there.
the potential is there. The potential is there in spades, but the leadership and the organization's not there. That's the part of the equation that's missing. That actually, Black Lives Matter. If there was a revolutionary socialist party in the United States with roots in oppressed Black communities, mass organization, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of members, uh, Black the George Floyd movement could have developed into a revolutionary potential. But without that, it inevitably dissipated. So similarly, people want unions. People are in favor of unions, but union density doesn't increase. It's a combination of, well, on the one side, anti-union laws,
Right.
difficult to overcome, difficult to overcome, and secondly, the leadership of the unions. The consciousness of the new unions is totally capitalist and totally looking in the past. Actually, if you read any sort of union education material, they all look at the 1950s and the 1960s as how things are supposed to be. And so, this is how capitalism is supposed to be. There's supposed to be reforms. There's supposed to be improvements of standards of living. And that is objectively what happened in the West, at least in the 50s and 60s. But if you actually look at the last century of global capitalism, what you see is 80 years of crisis or 75 years of crisis and 25 years of growth. So it's actually the 50s, 60s that are the anomaly through a general tendency of a century of crisis. So, so we're not going to go back to the 60s. Ain't going to happen. Never going to happen. We're going to be bumbling along from one crisis to another until the workers get organized enough to put this system to bed.
How
Right?
did they organize without a social like civil society, bowling clubs, like these simple things that used to exist, fraternity club, fraternal organizations, like so much of civil society, so much of society has been broken apart. That used to exist, um, the 1700s, 1800s, um, that has been fractured. So the part of the subjective element is this I think this alienation and this phone and social media um, culture, which in some ways connects us more, but without the face to
It doesn't
face.
last forever. Material reality wins out always. Material reality always wins out. And again, the pendulum like has gone back and forward between atomization and organization in the working class perpetually over the last 200 years, from atomization to organization, and then back to atomization promoted by the capitalists. So there is no constant in this, but people can come together very quickly. I think, like, you know, George Floyd movement is a fantastic example of that. That it's not as if things were that much more communally minded. Uh, how long ago was that movement? 3 years, 4 years ago?
4 years, yeah.
So 4 years ago, this is same working class, same population. Something like apparently 10% of the American population participated in a BLM protest.
It might have even been more than that. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was a lot.
yeah. So that's the potential for revolutionary consciousness to develop. Consciousness changes just like that. But it needs organization to structure it and give it options. And so that's why I'm the whole sort of Chris's and platypus falling into mutual aid to so-called build the capacity of the working class. This just ends up being reformism and charity. It doesn't do anything, and it's trying to create this fantasy land perfect development of the working class that never existed in human history ever. You set the bar too high, and then you're so very disappointed that the workers have let me down so very much. They haven't reached this level. That the uh, the revolutionary professor checking the temperature of the working class. Oh, sorry, you're too cold for revolution, right? It's a complete misunderstanding of how politics and consciousness is actually very dynamic, is often conservative, resists change until reality breaks through that conservative barrier and changes very rapidly. It's the dialectic of consciousness.
Okay, and then all right. Well, then let's kind of move it to a little bit more towards the what is to be done side. And
Maybe
go
I
ahead.
want to say a little bit more about union leadership,
Sure.
right? So again, an analogy. There's a ton of analogies. The one analogy is that of a volcano. So
Yes.
the workers' movement, it's like lava flowing, right? So it's incredibly powerful, bursts everything away. So and it creates, and as movements go, they create organizations out of them. So here you've got your crack in the Earth's crust, uh, lets the lava, the magma out, creates a volcano. But then as it cools, there's a plug. There's what's known as a volcanic plug that actually resists the pressure. And then there's a new movement years later. Sometimes it blows that plug away, and sometimes that plug is too strong, and there's actually a side vent, right? The movement goes in a different direction. And you could just look at the plug and say, oh, the plug's too strong, the plug's too strong. It's like the pressure's still from below. The pressure's still from below, and eventually that pressure will have an outlet. And any study of history shows this. It can take a long period of time until that explosion happens. It could be quite a long period of time in the life of a human being. But in terms of history, I've been an adult for like 30 years. and that's quite a long time. I've seen some stuff, right? But in terms of history, 30 years is nothing, right?
So
So
that
yeah,
outlet, that expression, that's
yeah.
going to happen no matter what, and I agree. They're going to keep happening, no matter how bad things seem to have been in the last 10, 20, 30 years. They're gonna pop up again, 100%.
Mhm.
Now, so and that's going to be expressed in, like, could be Black Lives Matter, could be the anarchist led 1% movement, or We Are the 99%. What how do we trust?
Ironically, actually, the anarchists hated Occupy.
Oh, did well, so,
Yeah, they hated it.
some of them let it.
No, they didn't.
David
No,
Graeber.
the organized anarchists hated Occupy.
Ah,
Anarchist groups of 2011. I was there. Yeah, they utterly hated it and boycotted it. And then it was anarchist, definitely with a small A.
okay, yeah, because there's certainly some anarchist elements there.
I was very, very anarchist, but the anarchists hated it.
Right. Okay,
Bit of
I see.
irony for you.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. Um, okay, yeah. So the expression, a a Marxist cater organization, revolutionary organization. Um, that's mainly how does a Marxist cater organization that's mainly focused on students become a mass movement that represents all interests? Because
It
that
shouldn't it shouldn't be mainly focused on students, right? Um, it probably will be when it's, you know, just a couple of hundred strong, but then you've got to take those students and take them to the broader working class, right? So it shouldn't just be students. That would be a mistake. And if it was just students and it was had a membership of thousands, that'd be a huge mistake,
So what?
right?
How do they make the How does one? Because most of the organizations around today are in that small stage, or
Yeah.
they're coming close to growing out of it. How do they make that transition? Um, Coming from more of a student background, where there's a tendency to both reject but also embody some of the academic trends that have held the movement back, the left back more generally,
Yeah.
and
Well,
make the
the thing is,
trans.
I'm not anti-student, and actually, the students are a lot more working class than they ever were. Something like 40% of young people go into higher education. So to say that 40% of the population, yeah, it's only 60% of the population is working class. That that minute you go to university, you're not working class. That's just doesn't correspond to reality.
I think
So
that's definitely true, but but I think they're also more likely to to adopt a bourgeois or
oh,
sorry,
totally.
petty bourgeois or PMC perspective in the
Absolutely.
universities.
And that's why education really matters in political organizing. So you've got to make sure that they don't fall into any of this postmodernist bullshit, right? So, and then you got to build, and you don't say, okay, we need to have industrial workers be the first member of our organization. No, you need to build an organization that's viable. That's the first task, and not worry so much about social composition. But then once that organization has stability, then you've got to teach the students how to engage with workers. Got to. And that is the history of many successful revolutionary organizations. They started off with intellectuals. What were Marx and Engels if not intellectuals? Right? They were philosophy grad students. That's what they were. Right? Engels was bourgeois, right? And it's that's where revolutionary movements often start. Doesn't have to. Well, actually, one classic example is James Connolly, who was a worker and led the Easter Uprising, right? So fantastic flower of the working class. But quite often, first layers aren't industrial workers. You got to build that organizational stability. You do that when you've got a few hundred people. And then you've got to educate those people to be able to speak in common, the common tongue, English, French, German, etc., whatever country you may be in, to not sound like an alien. And there's an art to that. And actually, Trotsky's transitional demands and transitional program are a very good method in order to engage with the consciousness of working class people and speak a common language. That look, okay, you want free education, you want full employment, you want social housing, you want, X, Y, Z, healthcare, uh, whatever the issue of the day, transport, you know, whatever the issue of the day, you want that. Let's organize for it. You want peace. You want an end to imperialism and war. And you link that thing that the working class wants to the necessity to overthrow capitalism, because capitalism cannot give the working class what they want. Right. That's transitional demands, transitional method. And so you've got to educate people in that. And ironically, I hear these horrendous academics sort of, oh, Marxism so abstract, blah, 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 blah. No worker will ever understand it. And it's like, you know what? I don't understand you. But at the same time, when I've seen capable
Mm.
Marxists, experienced Marxists, I I like to think that I speak in fairly common language and am understandable, except for that word right there. Um, um, and the task is to be able to explain potentially complex ideas in a simple way, a convincing way. People may agree with you, they may disagree with you, but at least they understood what you were saying and you weren't using bizarre language. Um, so it's actually the academics that are the most guilty of this. And political organizers, capable political organizers, can take complex ideas and make them understandable.
So okay, this is good because yeah, this ties us back to the conversation you had with Chris, and maybe we can end on your response to this point.
Yeah.
Is that yeah, he was saying that similar to Trotsky's transitional demands is that Chris was saying the task is actually uh, policies and changes and organizing around things that could be left liberal demands. Could be anti-imperialism, could be housing, could be XYZ, and that
What did he mean when he said liberalism? I still don't
in
understand
the
that.
sense that let's he was saying let's organize around these uh, changes within capitalism. Obviously, that'll push the struggle forward, but without necessarily tying it to because he's suggesting that when you tie it right back to revolution and to Marxism, then when you're talking to those workers and they look around and they say, "Well, I don't see a viable socialist left to be able to do that," then they kind of get dissuaded or disenchanted or whatever, and that the task then is to make those same demands, but without necessarily injecting the Marxism in right away until you have that viable uh, left independent working class movement where it makes sense for a socialist in Marxism discourse and language to be brought up, right? Because he's saying it's
This
premature.
is this
It's
is this is
premature,
all wrapped in its own internal contradictions and ends up with reformism, or not even reformism, liberalism, right? You don't start by a negation. Oh no, can't mention this. Oh no, can't mention that. You start from the workers need housing, right?
I think he would agree with that though.
Wrapped up in the most pessimistic, awful language, right? And the reality is the capitalism cannot provide the workers housing.
Right.
Can't. Absolutely cannot. Should we say that it can?
We should make the
No.
demands. We should make the demands and
Make
go
the
for it
demands,
anyway.
and yet and it becomes blatantly freaking obvious that capitalism cannot provide this, right? And and it's not have a socialist left, it's build a mass movement of workers, right? There's this sectarian obsession with, sort of like the perfect organization. No, it's say, look, let's build we need housing. The rent is too damn high. We need housing. We need a mass movement to demand social, non-profit, non-market housing of, affordable, rent geared to income. The word affordable housing has been completely misused, right? Non-market housing, public housing, build a mass movement on that basis, and then you'll see who your enemies are. The, the builders, the big construction companies, the banks, all the rest of it. And it will become evident that this is not compatible with modern capitalism. It isn't. But if you build a mass movement over this demand, and I don't know, would Chris call that a liberal demand? It's like it's ridiculous. No, it's a working class demand. It's a demand in the benefit of the working class.
He just means that within the bounds of the liberal worldview, this you can make this demand, and not kind of exit that worldview necessarily, like not go beyond it.
It's just the worst way of expressing yourself. Like actually, it's not even sort of technically correct. Like if you're talking about liberalism, well, you're really talking about Enlightenment philosophers, right? You're talking about equality under the law, that kind of stuff. And again, an end to feudal rights, right? If you're going to be technically correct. So it's like, again, it's like, no, these are working class demands. Public housing, social housing, rent geared to income. These are economic demands that will benefit the working class. There's nothing liberal about it. Liberals have never cared about benefiting the working class. The revolutionary liberals were about abstract rights and equality, which then resolved down to the equality of exploitation.
Right.
Right. That's liberalism in a Marxist sense. Right. So it's a fair definition of liberalism. No, these are demands that will benefit the working class, and you put them front and center, and you don't apologize for criticizing capitalism. You don't apologize for being a revolutionary socialist, and you say, look, if capitalism can give us this, if we can build a big enough movement that capitalism will give us this, great. Right? Fan-freaking-tastic. But let's build a big enough movement and find out whether the capitalists will give us this. And it's possible that they cannot. They will say that they can't. The capitalists say, oh, we can't afford this. We can't afford this. And the reformist, the liberal, would say, oh, the capitalists can't afford it. Let's go home. Where a revolutionary says, capitalism can't afford this. We workers must have it. Therefore, capitalism must go. And it's like, that is perfectly understandable to working class people. This is not an alien language. And if you bite your tongue in the middle of that, you're preparing defeat. You're preparing demoralization. Whereas it's walking the steps. It's not what Chris is saying. Chris is just a miserable bastard. Right? Every part of his language is incapable of actually organizing anyone except miserable students and grad students especially. Right? Demoralized people who say, oh, it's going to be decades away. And what do we end up doing? Charity to build the capacity of the working class. The working class's capacity is built as much as it's going to be objectively. What we need to build is a subjective factor. Why aren't mass movements victorious? Because the leadership of the unions is utterly bankrupt and has a consciousness based upon the past. How do you think you're going to kick those people out without being organized, without revolutionary organization? It's politics, not abstract economics building capacity. And it's a complete misunderstanding of the last 150, 200 years of working class history, looking back at a fantasy land of the working class that never existed. It's always atomized, always difficult, always changing nature of the working class. So they create this perfect working class that never actually existed. It's always been difficult.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. His argument would be that building a cater organization would be having setting up a socialist party, a revolutionary organization, in relation to something that does not yet exist, and then so that yeah. So he would say it's
But if you,
premature
yeah,
because of that.
yes, but if you try, but if it does exist and you haven't built it, it's too freaking late, right? It's entirely chicken and egg. The fact that building a revolutionary organization is something that could be done in good times as well as bad, right? Most importantly, in bad times when nobody's interested. Because when it's good times, it's too late. The tasks are too big. All right. So, oh, well, it's not revolutionary. So I'm not going to do anything. Oh, 5 years from now, it is revolutionary. All right. I'll start doing anything. Oh, I'm sorry. And then you say to people, you need a revolutionary organization. And it's like, where's your organization? It's like, oh, okay. I don't have one. So it's too late. And then a revolutionary movement comes. And what happens? It gets seized by those who have an organization. And then you bemoan that, oh, it got betrayed and misled by these people. We last time we talked about Egypt, it got betrayed by the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. Blah 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 blah. Yeah, because the Muslim Brotherhood built an organization. So revolutionary socialists need to build an organization when it's difficult and nobody's interested.
They
So
were
that when
they had
when
mass
people,
right, but
yeah,
they had mass uh, kind of appeal, and they were a mass movement sort of already. Like they had their fingers in the society and the culture in a
yeah,
broad sense already.
yeah, but and that's what you've got to build before the revolution comes. When it's really tough, when nobody's interested. So then time changes. Yeah, history has shown this. Spanish Revolution is a good example. The uh, the POUM, the POUM came out of the ex-Trotskyists, right? Andres Nin, and off the top of my head, I think Nin had about 1,500 supporters in 1931. It's not a mass organization. Very, very small, right? I think approximately 1931. Right. And then in 1936, 37, at the height of the Spanish Revolution, the POUM had 90,000 members and and entered government. Shouldn't have entered government. That was a betrayal, but had enough support to enter government. And so an organization in those conditions was catapulted from 1,500 to 90,000. And and if they hadn't made a whole series of compromises and mistakes, like entering into the Republican liberal government, they could have then gone to hundreds of thousands and victory. So absolutely nothing, but they had enough of a base at the beginning of the revolution that they were seen as an option in the revolution. And the POUM itself did not create the revolution. The social crisis of Spanish capitalism, Spanish society, that created the revolution. So I, you, you've got to organize now. There's no alternative. Otherwise, when the revolution comes, you'll be totally powerless.
All right, Alex. Any final words? I think we're going to end the stream here. I think it's been you've made a good rebuke, I think, to the conversation last time, and clarified some things. Do you have any final parting thoughts?
It would be great if we had the luxury of just doing small deeds. That would be great. Okay, you could do a food kitchen. You could do a campaign to lower transit fares. or you could do this or that small thing. But the reality is there aren't enough revolutionaries around that you will make a fundamental difference in the social condition of the working class in the here and now. You won't. You won't. Now, you either reconcile yourself to petty reforms and charity and become a petty reformist and charity monger, or you stay as a revolutionary and understand that building an organization does take decades, it's really hard, does take decades. You sit down, you do the difficult work in making that a reality, and then hopefully you've done enough work so you've got into the at least thousands of people, organized people, depends upon the size of the country you're in. That when a revolutionary movement does come about, you're large enough to actually start playing a role and people listening to you. You can't escape that. You can't escape that. If you don't organize something, you will be powerless when it happens. And actually, okay, I've been politically active 30 something years, and I've seen enough revolutions come and gone. Venezuelan revolution, classic example. And there wasn't an existing revolutionary organization on strict Marxist basis there, and people desperately trying to build it, incredibly difficult in the middle of a revolution because the tasks are so big, the movement is so big, and your organization is so small. So you need to build it before when nobody's interested, and everybody's laughing at you, and they think you're ridiculous, and you've got to have the courage to be the lone voice in the wilderness, understanding that the correct ideas will win out in the long run.
Thank you, Alex. And everybody, thanks for watching. Leave a comment. Tell us what you thought of this discussion, and or maybe tell us what topic you'd like us to handle in the future, or what guests you'd like to have on or have Alex talk to. But for now, thanks for watching and goodbye.